So I am so pleased to have on the line today very special guest, Dr. Marv Treiger, who is a retired psychotherapist, PhD, doctorate in psychology. He is also a former Marxist radical who was so far to the left, as we've been talking with him about, that at one point, the 50th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution, he and a group of comrades bolted from the Communist Party because it wasn't communist enough. It was communist in name only, not far enough to the left. Well, in this century in particular, he had his roto-rooter process that eroded that leftism and became a conservative, and now is even a strong supporter of President Donald Trump. Marv, it is so great once again to have you here. Thanks for sticking around today and being a part of the program. We really got in the first segment into some depth about understanding some of the identity politics roots on the left and also your own ideological development over time, from being someone who helped Bernardine Dohrn tweak a speech in the 1960s and who was involved in very many different radical movements and so forth back then, on to becoming a conservative now. Today, you might have seen in the news a thing or two about a little bit of civil unrest that's going on in the country today. And there was so much of what you said at a few different points in the first segment that just really resonated with the dynamics today. And I do want to talk about some of these different elements, but I've spoken long enough, so please sort of set the stage here on what your sense is for what we're seeing.
Well, the first thing that I think is worth noting, that I've noted, is that the demonstrations that are going on right now, the protests, the rioting, the looting, have a certain different quality than they did in the 60s, particularly during the civil rights movement. What did a peaceful protest look like in the civil rights movement? Well, you might have 30 people across the front line, maybe Martin Luther King and Ralph Abernathy and all of the different leaders, and then people behind them and holding signs and protesting, and and then they would have monitors so that the demonstrators monitored their own forces. For the most part, they didn't need the police to monitor it. In fact, the police in the South would attack the march and were the opponents of the march. So when violence erupted, it erupted because of a police attack on a peaceful march. Now, the protesters like to talk about the right of assembly and the right of peaceful protest, and absolutely, that's a proper thing to do. However, what we have in these marches is you have something that, maybe begins and starts like a peaceful protest, but it starts to involve provoking and confronting the police and haranguing the police. And then people start lobbing things from the back and egging on the police to do something, and bricks are thrown and stones are thrown. And then the so-called peaceful protesters, they don't try to stop the people who are doing that in the back. They're, that's all, part of them as far as they're concerned. And then as day turns into night, the level of violence steps up, and the afternoon's peaceful protester becomes an evening's violent protester. Now, added to that, you have organized groups like Antifa that generally the left tends to work through mass movements where they lead the mass movements, but they hide their own full program. And but in these, and that's a generalization, but in these demonstrations, you actually have groups with their own specific program, like Antifa, who hide themselves because they're engaged in so much violence, and Black Lives Matter movement, and that movement is led by Marxists. the founder. You can go on the internet and find it. Supports Marxism, and was answering a question from an interviewer that said, "Tell me, what's going to happen to the Black Lives movement? Is it going to disintegrate? Is it going to dissolve once the demonstration?" No. We're ideological. We're Marxists. We're trained Marxists, and we're organized. And then another leader of the movement said that with regard to these stained glass windows and statues in Europe, that Jesus's images should be smashed. And this was because Jesus was portrayed as a Caucasian in many of these images. And of course, Jesus was portrayed in all sorts of countries, more or less looking like the people of that country, just for the sake of easier identification. But that was enough to want this organization and this guy to destroy
and
those
Marv,
kinds of.
I do have we do have the tweet actually, and for those watching,
Oh,
we're going to
really?
have Nathan Matouche put the tweet up on the screen. This is Sean King, one of the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement, and you're right. He was specifically talking about how white supremacy was exemplified in stained glass windows of, quote, white Jesus, and therefore they needed to be taken down. And one of the things that I was expressing the other day is a concern about how they might go for, they've already been tearing down statues. I wouldn't be surprised if some of these people start actually destroying stained glass windows in churches across the country. Now, I hope that's not the case, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was.
Don't be surprised.
Yeah, exactly.
Look, when they're destroying statues, so that's what they're doing. Those are objects, right? Symbolic and with great attention, without anybody voting on it or any democratic decision to remove it or anything like that, any discussion. So it's completely undemocratic and it's complete mob rule. But in addition to that, they're engaged in cancel culture through the internet and through pressure on organizations and businesses. Anyone who steps out of line loses their job and is out. So if you're destroying statues and you're canceling the culture of people, pretty soon it will reach the point, it seems to me, when they will start taking out people. I mean, it has to go to that next step at
Marv,
some point along the line.
We have seen some extremists already who have beaten elderly women, for example. Now, I do want to say that I think I talk with a lot of people who believe in Black Lives Matter, are supporters of the cause, but what most people, I think, believe, and even most of the people who show up to these during the day protests, most of them believe, hey, there is racial injustice, there's excessive policing that particularly targets people of color, especially black people, and we need reform. And they genuinely believe that there needs to be change. But then you have this fringe group that has all of this this sense of strength that they can go out there and bring down all the statues or loot property or burn down courthouses and what have you, particularly because they can get away with it. My contention is that those people are less serious about some kind of genuine, at least racial improvement cause, and have either a much more radical agenda, or they're just trying to push the limits to see how far they can go with destroying private property and even public property and eradicating property protection and this notion of property rights, how far they can go before the police will intervene. So I think most of the people who say they support Black Lives Matter genuinely believe that as something sincere but not radical. And then you have these radical elements. However, where there's a rub is the radical and extremists that are destroying property are not only getting away with it because the police aren't acting to stop it, but they're getting away with it because others who say they support Black Lives Matter are, for one reason or another, unwilling to condemn that kind of activity. And I think for most, it's out of fear. But in some cases, you may see some of the more extreme elements who may find themselves thinking, you know what, this is okay with me. Let them do it if they want to.
Well, I don't think that it's very clear what the Black Lives Matter movement and in general, what the reforms that are being sought are.
Right.
As a matter of fact, in most of the cities, remember, all of these cities, just about all of them, are run by the Democratic Party. Atlanta, for example, the police force is 58% African American. The mayor is black. The
police
whole
chief was,
structure of the police chief was also black. So and there have been reforms, and you're not finding in those places, and the statistics do not show, like in the number of dead blacks killed by whites versus the number of whites killed by black, police officers and all of that kind of stuff. Pretty much this is not fundamentally a problem anymore.